The police were called at exactly 2:17 a.m., not because something had been stolen, but because something inside that mansion refused to stay where it belonged, as if an invisible hand had begun rewriting the rules of a home built on control. When they arrived, Daniel Carter, a man known for precision and power, stood in the center of his living room, his voice steady, but his eyes searching for something he couldn't explain, insisting that someone inside his house was moving things, watching him, playing a quiet game he could not win, and every piece of evidence he gathered led him to one person who had always been there, the maid he trusted, the woman who had never once raised suspicion, the only one who could move freely through every room without question. And yet, even as he accused her, even as his voice hardened with certainty, there was something else in that house that night, something far more unsettling, something that didn't leave fingerprints, didn't make noise, didn't break locks, but still managed to leave a trail behind. By the time investigators began reviewing the security footage, the story should have been simple: another case of misplaced trust, another quiet betrayal hidden behind routine and familiarity. But what they found instead forced them to stop, rewind, and watch again, because nothing about what they were seeing made sense. Objects shifting without warning, doors opening without a sound, patterns forming where there should have been none. And in the middle of it all, two small figures who were never supposed to be part of the story. Two children who lived in complete silence, who couldn't hear a single accusation, who couldn't respond to a single word spoken about them. And yet somehow, impossibly, they were at the center of everything that was happening. Daniel Carter had built his life on control, every detail measured, every outcome predicted. A man who believed that if something went wrong, there was always a reason, always someone responsible. And for years, that belief had never failed him, not in business, not in life, not even after the night he lost his wife, the night that changed his home forever, leaving behind two children who would grow up in a world without sound, a world where communication had to be learned differently, a world where silence became their language. And while he provided them with everything money could offer, the best doctors, the best care, the safest environment imaginable, there was something he never quite learned how to give them, something that couldn't be bought or installed or secured behind walls and cameras. At first, the changes were small, easy to dismiss: a misplaced object here, a door left slightly open there, things that could be explained away by distraction or routine. But Daniel was not a man who ignored patterns, and when those patterns began repeating, when the same disturbances started appearing night after night, always just out of reach, always just beyond explanation, he began to watch more closely, checking locks, reviewing schedules, narrowing down possibilities until only one remained: the person who had access to everything, the person who was always present yet never questioned, the maid who had worked in his home for years without incident, until suddenly, everything pointed to her. He confronted her without hesitation, his voice calm but firm, laying out the evidence as he saw it, the timing, the access, the opportunity. And while she denied everything, while her confusion seemed genuine, while her words carried a weight that should have made him pause, he didn't, because in his world, there was always a logical answer, always a clear cause, and he believed he had already found it. But what he didn't realize, what no one realized in that moment, was that the truth had already been recorded, sitting quietly in hours of footage no one had fully examined, waiting to be seen in the right way. When the investigators finally sat down to review the security cameras, they expected confirmation, something clear, something undeniable, something that would close the case quickly. But instead, they found themselves watching the same moments over and over again, noticing details that didn't align, movements that didn't match the timeline, gaps that shouldn't exist in a system designed to capture everything. And as they slowed the footage down, frame by frame, something began to emerge. Something subtle at first, almost easy to miss, but once seen, impossible to ignore. In the background of one clip, just barely within view, one of the children moved, not randomly, not aimlessly, but with intention. And then in another clip, the second child appeared, mirroring the same behavior. Their actions quiet, deliberate, coordinated in a way that raised more questions than answers. And suddenly, the entire narrative began to shift, because these were children who could not hear alarms, who could not respond to spoken instructions, who lived in a world defined by silence. And yet here they were, moving through the house in ways that suggested awareness, purpose, even strategy. The investigators kept watching, piecing together fragments of movement, moments that had been overlooked because they didn't fit the expected story. And with every new clip, the same unsettling realization grew stronger. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. This was something else entirely, something that had been happening right in front of everyone without being understood, something that challenged the very assumptions Daniel had built his life around. And as the footage continued to unfold, it became clear that the person he had accused was not the one responsible, that the explanation he had clung to was beginning to fall apart. But the most unsettling part wasn't just who was involved, it was why. Because as the pieces started to connect, as the patterns became clearer, the question was no longer about who had moved the objects or opened the doors. It was about what could drive two children, living in silence, to create a series of events so precise, so intentional, that they could go unnoticed for so long, and what they were trying to communicate in a house where no one had been listening. And just when it seemed like the answer was within reach, just when everything was about to make sense, one final piece of footage appeared, something no one had seen before, something that changed the direction of the entire investigation in an instant, because what it revealed was not just unexpected, it was something that forced everyone in that room to question everything they thought they understood about that house, those children, and the man who believed he had everything under control. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what those cameras captured next was something no one was prepared to explain. What those cameras captured next didn't answer the questions, it multiplied them. Because the more the footage was reviewed, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple case of suspicion or misunderstanding. Something had been happening inside that house for weeks, maybe longer. Something organized, something deliberate. And yet, no one had reported hearing anything. No alarms, no footsteps, no voices, just silence and movement. Daniel Carter believed he knew his home. Every hallway, every locked door, every routine. But now, that certainty was beginning to crack. Because if the maid wasn't responsible, then who was? And more importantly, how was it happening right under his roof without a single sound? The investigators paused on one frame, then another, rewound, played it again. In one moment, a door was closed. In the next, it was slightly open. No one entering, no one leaving, just a quiet shift that shouldn't have been possible. And then, in the far corner of the screen, one of the children appeared again. Still, watching, almost as if they knew the camera was there. That's when the first real question took shape. Was the maid ever guilty? Or was she just the easiest person to blame? Because everything about her story still held up. Her schedule, her movements, her reactions. There were no signs of deception. No gaps big enough to explain what the cameras were now revealing. And yet, someone, or something, had been moving freely through that house. Then came the second question, the one no one wanted to say out loud. What were the children actually doing? They were deaf. They couldn't hear instructions, warnings, or even the accusations being thrown around them. And yet, their timing was too precise. Their presence too consistent. They appeared in moments that mattered and disappeared just as quickly. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional. But intentional for what? And then, the most unsettling question of all began to surface. How could all of this happen without anyone hearing a single thing? No footsteps, no dropped objects, no doors slamming, nothing, just silence. Perfect, uninterrupted silence. As if whatever was happening inside that mansion was designed to exist in a world where sound didn't matter. The deeper they looked, the more it felt like they were missing something obvious, something right in front of them. And Daniel, for the first time, started to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not control, but doubt. Because if he had been wrong about the maid, what else had he been wrong about? And just as that thought began to settle in, the footage revealed another detail. Small, easy to miss, but once seen, impossible to ignore. A signal, a gesture, something passed between the children that no one else in that house would have understood. And suddenly, this wasn't just about what was happening. It was about what had been happening all along. Because the truth wasn't starting now. It had been building quietly for years. And to understand it, you have to go back to where the silence began. To understand what those cameras captured, you have to understand the man who owned the house. Daniel Carter wasn't born into wealth. He built it from nothing, one decision at a time, one risk after another, until his name carried weight in every room he walked into. People described him as disciplined, focused, the kind of man who didn't leave things to chance. He believed everything in life could be controlled if you paid close enough attention. And for years, that belief worked. His businesses grew. His reputation strengthened. His life, from the outside, looked perfect. But there was a time when the house felt different. Warmer, lighter, before the silence settled in, before the routines became rigid. Back then, there was laughter. His wife, Emily, had a way of softening everything about him. She filled the spaces he couldn't. Where he was structured, she was present. Where he was distant, she was close. And for a while, it worked. They balanced each other. Until the night, everything changed. The twins were born on a night that was supposed to be the happiest of their lives. Instead, it became the moment that took everything from him. Emily didn't survive the complications. And in a single night, Daniel lost the one person who knew how to reach him. What he was left with were two children he didn't fully understand, and a silence that began to grow inside the walls of that house. Spencer and Savannah grew up in a world without sound. They never heard their father's voice, never heard music, laughter, or even their own names being called. Their world was built on movement, on expression, on things most people never notice. They communicated with each other in ways that didn't require words. Small gestures, quick glances, subtle signals that carried meaning no one else could read. They lived in silence, but they noticed everything. And that was the part no one paid attention to. Because while the house was quiet, it wasn't empty. The children were always watching, always learning, always aware of things happening around them, even when no one thought they were paying attention. Daniel did what he thought was right. He gave them everything money could provide. The best doctors, the best therapists, the safest environment. He installed cameras, security systems, routines that kept everything in order. He believed structure would protect them. But what he didn't realize was that structure can also create distance. And over time, that distance grew. He worked longer hours, spent less time at home. When he was present, he was focused on control, not connection. Conversations became instructions. Interactions became brief. And slowly, without him noticing, the children adapted to a life where their father was always near, but never truly there. Then there was Margaret, the maid. She had been with the family long before the tragedy. Quiet, dependable, the kind of person who blended into the background so completely you almost forgot she was there. She knew the house better than anyone, knew the routines, the habits, the unspoken tensions that filled the rooms. She watched the children grow, watched the distance between them and their father widen. And she never said a word. She saw things others didn't, but said nothing. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The house ran the way it always had. Clean, organized, predictable. But then, small things started to shift. A chair slightly out of position. A door left open when it should have been closed. Objects appearing in places no one remembered putting them. The kind of details most people would ignore. But Daniel wasn't most people. He noticed patterns. And once he started noticing, he couldn't stop. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Stress, distraction, too many late nights, not enough rest. But then it happened again, and again, always at night, always when the house should have been still. The same quiet disturbances, repeating with just enough consistency to feel intentional. And that's when something changed, because it stopped feeling like coincidence, and started feeling like someone was trying to be noticed. The night everything changed didn't begin with chaos. It began with something small. A soundless alert flashing across Daniel Carter's phone at 2:17 a.m., signaling that one of the interior motion sensors had been triggered. Not the perimeter, not the gates. Inside the house. A place designed to be sealed, predictable, controlled. For a moment, he stared at the screen, waiting for it to correct itself. It didn't. And then, almost immediately, a second alert followed. Another sensor. Another part of the house. Too far apart to be explained by a simple mistake. Daniel moved quickly, but not carelessly. He had trained himself to stay calm under pressure. Still, something about this felt different. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No voices. Just the faint hum of systems doing exactly what they were programmed to do. He checked the live feeds. One hallway. Empty. Another room. Still. The kitchen. Nothing. And yet, the system insisted something had moved. That was the first twist. The cameras showed nothing, but the sensors said otherwise. He walked through the hallway himself, scanning every corner, every shadow, expecting to find something out of place. But everything looked exactly as it should, until it didn't. A door at the end of the corridor, one he was certain had been closed earlier that night, now stood slightly open. Not wide, just enough to make him stop, just enough to make him question his own memory. He pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, nothing missing, nothing broken, but something felt off, and he couldn't explain why. The next morning, it got worse. A watch, one he kept in the same place every day, was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. Daniel didn't panic. He retraced his steps, checked every surface, every drawer. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No reason for it to be missing. And that's when the second twist landed. Only 3 people had access to that part of the house. Himself, the maid, and the children. At first, the idea didn't make sense. He dismissed the children immediately. In his mind, they weren't capable of something like this, which left only one possibility. And once that thought entered his mind, it didn't leave. He waited until Margaret arrived that morning, watched her routine, measured her behavior, looking for something, anything that didn't align. But she moved the way she always had. Quiet, focused, predictable, no signs of guilt, no hesitation. And yet, the missing watch sat in the back of his mind like proof he hadn't fully uncovered yet. By the third night, the pattern became undeniable. Another alert, another movement, another shift that couldn't be explained. And this time, Daniel didn't wait. He went straight to the control room and began pulling footage from the exact moment the sensor triggered. He expected to catch something clear, something final. Instead, he found something worse. A clip that showed the hallway exactly as it had been before. Empty. Still. No one entering. No one leaving. And then, just seconds later, the same door appearing open again. That was the third twist. Something was changing without being seen. That's when Daniel made his decision. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for more proof. He called Margaret into the room, placed the evidence in front of her, and spoke with a certainty that left no room for doubt. He told her he knew what she had been doing. He told her it had to stop. He didn't ask, he accused. Margaret stood there, confused, shaken, trying to understand what she was being blamed for. She denied everything. Calm at first, then desperate, her voice carrying a weight that should have made him hesitate. But Daniel had already made up his mind. In his world, the simplest answer was always the right one. And she was the only answer he had. What he didn't notice, what no one noticed in that moment, was where the children were standing. Watching, not reacting, not intervening, just watching. And for a brief second, something passed between them. A look, a signal, something quiet, something intentional. That was the fourth twist. Because while the accusation filled the room, the truth stayed silent. Margaret was sent away that day. Not fired, not yet, but removed. Watched. Isolated. And for the first time, the house felt different. Not calmer, not safer, just waiting. Because that night, the alerts didn't stop. They got worse. And this time, something else disappeared. Something that couldn't be explained away. Something that made Daniel realize he might have just accused the wrong person. But what no one realized was that the truth had already been recorded. The house didn't return to normal after that night. If anything, it became more tense, more uncertain, like something unfinished was still moving through it. Daniel didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every small sound, real or imagined, felt like a signal he was missing. Every room felt different now, as if the certainty he once had was slipping away piece by piece. Removing Margaret hadn't solved anything. If anything, it made things worse. Because the disturbances didn't stop. That was the first shift in the investigation. If the maid wasn't there, who was causing it? Daniel called in professionals, security specialists, system analysts, people who dealt in facts, not assumptions. They checked everything. The alarms, the locks, the camera feeds, looking for glitches, hacks, any sign that the system itself had failed. But everything came back clean. No breaches, no tampering, no outside interference, which meant the answer was still inside the house. That realization changed the tone completely. The footage became the focus. Hours of it. Days. Every angle, every room, every second reviewed again and again. At first, it showed exactly what it always had. Routine, predictable movement, empty hallways, closed doors, nothing that explained what Daniel had experienced. It almost made him question himself. Almost. But then, small inconsistencies began to surface. A chair slightly shifted between frames. A light left on that no one remembered turning on. Movements that didn't match the timeline. Subtle, easy to overlook, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. That was the second shift. Something was happening in the gaps. And then came the third. Margaret. Even though she had been removed, her earlier presence still lingered in the footage. Investigators began isolating her movements, tracking her routine down to the minute. And at first, it seemed to confirm everything Daniel believed. She was there during some of the disturbances. In the house. Alone in certain rooms. Close enough to have done it. It was enough to bring the suspicion back. But then the timeline didn't hold. Because in several clips, objects appeared to move after she had already left the frame. Not minutes later. Seconds. Too fast. Too precise. And suddenly, what looked like evidence against her started to fall apart. That was the fourth shift. The person they were looking for wasn't behaving like a person at all. Frustration built. The kind that comes from getting close to an answer, only to have it slip away. Daniel watched every clip himself now, over and over, trying to force a pattern to reveal itself, trying to find something everyone else had missed. And then, they slowed the footage down. Frame by frame. That's when everything changed. Because in those slowed frames, something new appeared. Not obvious. Not at first. But once seen, it couldn't be unseen. In the background of one clip, just at the edge of the screen, a small movement. A figure passing through too quickly to register at normal speed. One of the children. That was the moment the entire investigation shifted again. They went back, reviewed more footage, slowed everything down. And there it was again. Another frame. Another moment. Another appearance. Both children, at different times, in places they weren't expected to be. Moving in ways that didn't match the narrative Daniel had built in his mind. That was the fifth shift. The children weren't just present. They were involved. But involved in what? Because nothing about it made sense yet. Their timing was too exact. Their movements too coordinated. And yet, no one had seen them do anything directly. No clear action. No obvious explanation. Just fragments of presence, scattered across hours of footage. And then, one final clip surfaced. Different from the others. Longer. Clearer. And for the first time, it didn't just show movement. It showed intention. And what it revealed next was about to change everything. The clip didn't look important at first. Just another late-night recording, another quiet hallway, another moment that would have been dismissed at normal speed. But slowed down, frame by frame, it told a completely different story. Spencer stepped into view first, moving carefully, deliberately, his eyes fixed on something ahead of him. A second later, Savannah appeared behind him, her movements just as controlled, just as precise. They weren't wandering. They weren't confused. They were working together. That was the first break in everything Daniel believed. Because this wasn't random behavior. It was planned. In the next few frames, Spencer reached for an object on a nearby table, something small but noticeable. He hesitated for a moment, then looked back at his sister. She made a quick gesture with her hands. Subtle, fast, but clear. He nodded. And then, he moved the object. Not far. Just enough. Just enough for it to be out of place. That was the moment the pattern finally made sense. Every missing item. Every open door. Every shift that had kept Daniel awake at night. It wasn't someone sneaking through his house. It wasn't a system failure. It was them. The children. That was the twist no one expected. But it didn't answer the most important question. Why? The footage continued. Clip after clip. Different nights. Different rooms. The same behavior repeated with small variations. Moving objects. Opening doors. Creating just enough disruption to be noticed, but never enough to cause real damage. It was controlled. Careful. Almost strategic. That was the second twist. They weren't trying to take anything. They were trying to create something. Attention. The realization hit slowly, then all at once. Every action lined up with a moment Daniel had reacted. Every disturbance matched a night he had checked the cameras, walked the halls, tried to regain control. The children had learned his patterns, understood what made him respond, and they used it. They couldn't hear him, So they found another way to be seen. That truth changed everything. Because this wasn't misbehavior. It wasn't confusion. It was communication. The only kind they knew would break through the distance that had grown between them and their father. They had been trying to reach him in the only way that worked. But it went deeper than that. In one of the final clips, something even more revealing appeared. Spencer moved an object again, but this time, he didn't stop there. He looked directly toward the camera. Not by accident. Not by chance. He held his gaze for a second, then signed something. Savannah responded instantly. The investigators paused the footage, replayed it, slowed it down further, and when they translated the gesture, the meaning became clear. Now he'll come. That was the third twist. They weren't just acting randomly. They knew exactly what would happen next. They knew their father would check. They knew he would come looking. Every movement was timed around his reaction, which meant one thing. They had been watching him, just as closely as he had been watching them. Daniel saw it too. Every frame, every gesture, every moment he had misunderstood. The anger he felt toward Margaret began to collapse under the weight of what he was seeing. Because the truth wasn't hidden in some complex scheme. It had been right in front of him the entire time. And yet, something still didn't sit right. Because in that final clip, after Spencer signed those words, Savannah didn't just respond. She hesitated. For the first time in all the footage, she hesitated. And then she signed something back. Something the investigators couldn't fully make out. Something partially obscured. Something incomplete. And whatever she said made Spencer stop. That was the final twist. Because whatever message passed between them in that moment, it wasn't part of the pattern. It was something else. Something new. And suddenly, the question wasn't just why they started this. It was, what had they just realized? That hesitation changed everything. The footage froze on Savannah's hands mid-motion. Her expression no longer focused, no longer part of the quiet rhythm they had followed for weeks. It was different, slower, uncertain. The investigators leaned in, replaying it again and again, isolating each frame, trying to capture what she had said. But the angle blocked part of it. Only fragments were clear, just enough to understand the tone, but not the full meaning. Daniel saw it too. And for the first time, he didn't watch as a man trying to prove something. He watched as a father who had missed something. He went back to the beginning. Every clip, every movement. But now, he wasn't looking for patterns of intrusion. He was looking at their faces, their timing, the way they paused, the way they looked toward doors before moving anything, the way they waited after each action, as if expecting something in return. That was when the truth fully settled in. They hadn't just been trying to get his attention. They had been waiting for him to respond. And he never did. Not in the way they needed. That realization hit harder than anything else. Because every time they created a disturbance, every time they adjusted something just enough to be noticed, they were hoping for more than footsteps in the hallway. They were hoping for connection, for presence, for something that went beyond control. And instead, they got suspicion, accusation, distance. Margaret was cleared that same day. The evidence spoke for itself now. Every timeline corrected. Every assumption reversed. She returned, but nothing about her presence felt the same. Not because she had changed, but because the truth had finally been seen. She had never been the problem. She had only been the easiest answer. That was the first resolution. But the deeper one came later. Daniel didn't install more cameras. He didn't upgrade the system. He didn't tighten control. He did something he had avoided for years. He sat down with his children. No instructions. No assumptions. Just presence. At first, it was awkward. Unfamiliar. A man who had spent years speaking in certainty, now struggling to communicate without words. But the children didn't hesitate. They never had. They showed him. Slowly. Patiently. The same way they had been trying all along. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the house, but in him. Because for the first time, he realized that silence wasn't empty. It wasn't something to fix or control. It was something to understand. Something that had been speaking to him this entire time, in ways he had chosen not to see. And then, he remembered that final clip. Savannah's hesitation. The unfinished message. He asked them about it. And what they showed him was simple. But it stayed with him longer than anything else. Because what she had signed in that moment wasn't part of their plan. It was a question. A quiet, uncertain question. Do you think he sees us now? And for a long time, the answer had been no. But now, standing there, finally paying attention, finally present, it was the first time he could honestly say yes. Because in a house built on control, filled with systems designed to catch everything. The one thing that mattered most had almost gone completely unnoticed. In a house full of noise, the loudest cries were the ones no one could hear. And even after everything was uncovered, after the footage was explained, after the accusations were undone, after the silence finally began to make sense, one question still lingers. Because it's easy to look at Daniel Carter and see a man who made a mistake, a man who chose control over connection, a man who reacted instead of understanding. But is that really the whole story, or is it something much deeper than that? Because the truth is, nothing that happened inside that house started overnight. It built slowly, quietly, in moments that didn't seem important at the time. A missed interaction, a delayed response, a pattern of distance that no one thought would matter until it did. And by the time it became impossible to ignore, it had already changed everything. So the real question isn't just about what he did. It's about what he didn't see. Because those children never stopped trying. They never gave up. They adapted. They learned. They found a way to communicate in a world that wasn't built for them. And in doing that, they revealed something most people overlook. Sometimes, the problem isn't silence. It's what we choose to ignore inside it. And that raises a question that goes beyond this story. If you were in his position, would you have noticed sooner? Would you have seen the patterns for what they really were? Or would you have looked for the easiest answer, just like he did? And more importantly, how many moments like that exist in everyday life, unnoticed, misunderstood, quietly asking for attention? Because stories like this don't stand alone. There are others. Stories where the truth isn't hidden because it's impossible to find, but because no one is looking in the right place. Stories where the answer exists in plain sight, waiting for someone to slow down long enough to see it. And that's what makes this case stay with people. Not just what happened, but how close it was to being missed completely. So what do you think? Was Daniel truly at fault for what happened inside his home? Or was he simply a man who realized too late what really mattered? Take a moment and share your thoughts below. Because sometimes, seeing how others interpret a story like this reveals even more layers you didn't notice the first time. And if this story made you question how much we actually understand the people closest to us, then the next one will take that even further. Because this wasn't the only time something like this happened. There's another case where everything seemed normal on the surface until one small detail exposed a truth no one was prepared for. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories that don't just tell you what happened, but make you question how easily it could happen again.